In the last lecture, we created our service and I told you to not instantiate it on your own. I told you that Angular offers some great tool which will give us access to our services. It's Angular's dependency injector. What is a dependency injector? Well, a dependency is something a class of ours will depend on. For example, the new account component depends on that logging service because we want to call a method in that service. And the dependency injector simply injects this dependency, injects an instance of this class into our component automatically. All we need to do is we need to inform Angular that we require such an instance. So how do we inform Angular that we require such an instance? We add a constructor to the class, to the component, in this case where we want to use our service. So there I can bind it to a property by using this TypeScript shortcut of adding an accessor in front of the name of the argument to instantly create a property with the same name and bind the value to it. So here I will name this logging service. This name is totally up to you. Now this is the important part here though. Add a type assignment here. This is not optional. You need to set the type and the type has to be the class you want to get injected. Logging service in this case. Make sure to also add the import at the top. Now let me close the body of this constructor. And this simple task here informs Angular that we will need an instance of this logging service. Correctly, you might ask, well, how do we inform Angular? Why does this matter if we write this in the constructor? Think about who gives us the instance of this account component, this new account component here. This is a TypeScript class in the end, so somewhere this needs to get instantiated so that something happens in our app. Well, who is responsible for creating our components? Angular is, of course, because we're placing selectors in our templates. And when Angular comes across these selectors, it gives us instances of our components. Now, since Angular is responsible for instantiating our components, Angular will need to construct them correctly. So if we define in the constructor that we require some argument, Angular will recognize this, and now it tries to give us that argument. It tries to give us this, well, type in this case. So it knows we want an instance of the logging service class because we defined the type here. This is why this is important. Now that is almost enough, but not quite. Now Angular knows what we want, but it doesn't know how to give us such an instance. We need to do one additional step. We need to provide a service. Provide simply means we tell Angular how to create it. And that sounds very complicated, and it is very simple. All we have to do is add one extra property to the add component decorator, the providers property here. This also takes an array like other properties we added before. And here we again just have to specify the type of what we want to be able to get provided, you could say. So logging service again. Now with that, Angular, when analyzing the component, recognizes that it should be able to give us such a logging service, and it will set itself up to be able to do so. And when it then actually builds the component, constructs it, it sees that we want to have such an instance, and it will know how to give us such an instance. And now we can simply, in our component, anywhere in this component, access our logging service property, which is created automatically since I used this TypeScript shortcut here, and call log status change. So now I'm not creating that instance manually, Angular does it for us. And why is this better than creating it manually? You will see some other advantages later, but this basically lets you stay in the Angular ecosystem, and Angular knows how your app works. Again, some other advantages will come up later. So with this, we now have the same code as before. So if we have a look at our application again and create a new account, we still see the log here, depending on which status we chose here. So this still works, but now we're injecting the service. Now let's also do the same by copying that in the account component here. So here I will also add the constructor, And of course, here we also need to add the import, because TypeScript needs to know where this logging service comes from, not Angular, TypeScript. And I will also add my provider, of course, because for this component too, I need to inform Angular how to create this logging service. So if we do this and then go back to the application here, let it reload, create a new service again. This works. Now let's change the status, and this also still works. Now, of course, because I didn't replace this here, so let's call the logging service now and call log status change and pass the status. Now if we save this and try to change this, it still works. So now we got this same logging functionality outsourced, centralized in a service, and therefore our code here is a bit leaner. And I guess you can imagine how in bigger applications where you have duplicate code, a service can really help you to get more dry, to don't repeat yourself all the time, but instead to really cleverly outsource your code into a service and have it there. We saw how to use that logging service in the last lecture. Now let me show you another typical use case for a service to store and manage our data. So for example, our accounts. Right now I store them here in the app component, and then we have this chain of property and event binding to get data to the app component so that we there can update our accounts. Let's create a service for that. The account service maybe. So I will create this and I will export my accounts service class here, just like that. And here I will now copy in my accounts. So I will remove them from my app component and paste them into my accounts service. And I will add an add account method here where I simply expect to get an account name and status. And I will add an update status method where I expect to get the ID of the account I want to update and then the new status here. Now, the logic for these two methods is basically the same as in the app component. For a new account, or in the add account, I simply want to push a new account onto my array of accounts. And here I will simply quickly create a new object where I assign the name and the status, so the data we get passed into this method. And for the status changed, well, here I basically want to also just access my account with that ID here and set the status to, well, the new status we get passed as an argument too. So with that, this service looks all right. We got our our accounts there, and we got our methods to change something there. Of course, the app is broken though, because for one, I don't need that code in the app component anymore. If we have a look at the app component template, we still loop through all the accounts here. So I should still have my accounts here in the app component, but we removed them from here. They're now in the service. So we should maybe re-add them here, but now this should simply be an array of accounts. So each account object has a name, which is a string, and a status, which is a string. So I'm just defining the type here. And we want to have an array of such objects. Initially, it should be an empty array. This is what I'm saying here. Now, since we have our account service, we should inject it here as we learned it. So let's add our accounts service here of type account service. The type is super important to inform Angular about what we need here. Let's close this body of the constructor and make sure to add the import at the top pointing to your account service file. Now, what did we learn? We also need to add a provider. So here at the providers array, we should add accounts service so that Angular knows how to create such an account service. With that, we can now add, for example, onInit, this onInit lifecycle hook, as most initialization should not be done in the constructor, but instead here, and simply set this accounts equal to this account service which is available as a property because I use this shortcut with the accessor in front of the argument name. And here I can access my accounts field. Just as a little note, since accounts here is an array, it is a reference type. This is normal JavaScript behavior. So this is a reference type. So by setting it equal here, we're actually getting access to the exact same array as stored in the service. Just as a side note. So with that, we do have access to the accounts. And if we save this and have a look at our application, this still seems to work. These buttons will not work and will actually give us errors because I removed the event listeners. But in general, this looks all right. We can see the free accounts which are now stored in our account service. So with that, let's go back to our application. And here, I now want to update the account component and the new account component. Let's start with the new account. Here, we no longer need to emit this event here because we're not listening to it anyways. So we can get rid of the output here, get rid of the imports up here of event emitter and output. And instead, we should inject our service, our accounts service of type accounts service. And what did we learn? We should provide it, right? So let's add account service, and make sure to add the import at the top. Now with this, in here, I can call account service, add account, and pass the account name and the account status, as this is what this method expects to get as arguments. So with that, let's go to our account component now. Let's also get rid of the output here. We still need the inputs because we're still receiving that data from outside. And we can get rid of this event calling here. We remove the output anyways. Get rid of the imports we don't need anymore. And now here, I also want to get access to the account service. So let's inject it here too. Maybe in a new line to make it more readable. The accounts service of type accounts service, like this. Make sure to add the import at the top, and let's add it to the providers array here. With that, I can now call it here, account service, call update status, pass my ID, and the new status. Again, this is what this method expects. If we now save this and go back to our application, it looks all right, but we quickly realize that if we click on add account, we don't get an error. We get the log, but I don't see the account. If I click these buttons, I also see the log, but I don't see the change here. So something is not working correctly. It seems like it doesn't, right? Well, let's have a look at what's going wrong here in the next lecture.